The rain hammered Highway 9 like bullets as Sarah's motorcycle sputtered to a stop. 8 months pregnant and exhausted, she spotted the stone hut through the storm, a miracle in the wilderness. Her 2 children, Emma and Jake, clung to her as they stumbled inside, desperate for shelter. But the hut wasn't empty. Fresh blood stained the wooden floor. A laptop sat open, displaying photos that made Sarah's heart stop cold. Her own face stared back at her from a surveillance file dated 3 years ago, the same face from her old life, before she became Sarah the biker mom, before she ran from everything she'd once been. Sarah Martinez wasn't just any pregnant woman seeking shelter. She was a former FBI agent who'd faked her death to escape a corruption scandal that threatened her unborn child. Now, someone had found her trail. The laptop screen flickered to a new image, her children's school photos. A message appeared. "We know you're alive. We know where you are. You have 24 hours. Outside, car engines roared through the storm, getting closer. But who had found her? The corrupt agents she'd betrayed, or the criminals she'd put away? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled Emma and Jake behind an overturned table, her mind racing through possibilities. The blood on the floor was still wet, pooling around what looked like drag marks, leading toward a back door she hadn't noticed before. Someone had been here minutes ago. "Mama, what's wrong?" Emma whispered, her 8-year-old voice barely audible above the thunder. Jake, only 6, pressed his face against Sarah's shoulder, sensing danger the way children do. "Shh, baby. We're playing hide and seek," Sarah murmured, though her eyes never left the laptop screen. The surveillance photos kept cycling. Images of her at the grocery store last week, dropping the kids at school, filling up at the gas station. They'd been watching for months. The car engines outside grew louder, closer. Sarah counted at least 3 vehicles, maybe 4, too many for a chance encounter. Her fingers instinctively reached for the Glock tucked beneath her leather jacket, muscle memory from years of federal training she'd hoped never to use again. On the laptop, a new window opened, a video call. The screen remained black, but a voice emerged, distorted by electronic modulation. "Agent Rebecca Chen. Or do you prefer Sarah Martinez these days?" Sarah's blood turned to ice. Rebecca Chen was her real name, buried so deep she'd almost forgotten it herself. Only a handful of people knew that identity. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered into the laptop's microphone. A low chuckle. "The corruption investigation into Operation Nightfall. You thought you could disappear after testifying against Deputy Director Harrison. Thought your death in that warehouse fire was convincing." Sarah remembered that night. The setup, the realization that her own bureau wanted her silenced. She'd barely escaped, using her knowledge of FBI protocols to stage her death while pregnant with Jake. For 3 years, she'd lived off the grid, moving from town to town, keeping her children safe. "What do you want?" she asked. "Harrison's trial starts Monday. Your testimony put him away, but his conviction depends on evidence only you can provide. The insurance drives you hid. We need them." The insurance drives. Sarah's heart pounded as she remembered the encrypted storage devices containing proof of Harrison's involvement with the Kozlov crime family. She'd hidden them before faking her death, insurance in case someone came hunting. "And if I refuse?" "Your children are quite lovely. Emma's teacher says she's gifted in mathematics. Jake's soccer coach thinks he has real potential." Rage flooded through Sarah, hot and violent. "Touch my children and—" "You're what? You're dead, remember? No identity, no backup, no support. But we're not unreasonable. Deliver the drives to the courthouse Monday morning and your family walks away clean. New identities, relocated safely. Everyone wins." Car doors slammed outside. Heavy boots splashed through puddles, circling the hut. Sarah counted footsteps, at least 6 men, probably armed, definitely professional. "How do I know you won't kill us anyway?" she demanded. Because we're not Harrison's people. We're the ones who want him to stay buried. Some secrets are worth more than revenge. The laptop screen flickered again, showing a live feed from inside her apartment across town. Her few precious belongings, the children's toys, everything they'd built in their new life was being systematically searched. "Mama?" Jake's voice was smaller now, frightened. Sarah made her decision. "The drives aren't here. We know. But you're going to get them. My associates outside will escort you. Consider it protective custody." A flashlight beam swept across the hut's front window. Sarah heard radio chatter, tactical movements. These weren't street thugs. They moved like federal agents. "One more thing, Agent Chen," the voice continued. "The blood you're looking at? That was the last person who tried to run from us. He chose poorly." The laptop screen went black as the front door exploded inward. The door groaned against the wind as Sarah pushed it shut, the sound echoing through the cramped space like a gunshot. She fumbled for her phone's flashlight, the pale beam revealing a single room that hadn't seen human presence in years. Dust motes danced in the light, and the air carried the musty scent of abandonment mixed with something else, something metallic that made her stomach clench. Emma whimpered against her shoulder, tiny fingers clutching at Sarah's soaked jacket. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, though her voice trembled. "We're safe now." The beam swept across rough-hewn walls adorned with faded hunting photographs and a calendar frozen on March 2019. A rickety table dominated the center of the room, its surface littered with empty beer bottles and cigarette butts. In the corner, a moth-eaten sleeping bag lay crumpled beside a camping stove that looked like it hadn't been touched in months. Thunder crashed overhead, making Emma cry out. Sarah bounced her gently while surveying their temporary shelter. The roof seemed solid enough, no drips despite the torrential rain hammering above. They could wait out the storm here, then continue to her sister's place in the morning. She settled onto a dusty wooden chair, cradling Emma close. The baby's fever had broken during their desperate flight through the woods, but Sarah knew they needed to reach the hospital soon. Emma's breathing was still labored, each tiny wheeze a knife in Sarah's chest. "Just a little longer, sweetheart," she murmured, pressing her lips to Emma's damp forehead. "Aunt Katie will help us figure everything out." The words felt hollow. Katie would help with Emma's medical care, certainly, but the rest, the crushing debt, the foreclosure notice, David's threats, those problems would follow them wherever they went. Sarah had thought fleeing in the middle of the night was their only option, but now, sitting in this abandoned shelter, doubt crept in like the cold seeping through the walls. A sudden gust of wind rattled something behind her. She turned, phone light dancing across what appeared to be a closet door hanging ajar. Inside, she glimpsed the edge of something that didn't belong, a splash of color too bright for this weathered place. Emma had finally settled into an uneasy sleep. Sarah eased herself up, keeping one protective hand on her daughter while investigating the closet. The door creaked as she pulled it fully open, revealing a space barely large enough for a person to stand. Her breath caught. Hanging from a rusted nail was a woman's purse, expensive leather, the kind Sarah had once carried before her world collapsed. But that wasn't what made her hands shake. Pinned to the closet's back wall was a collection of photographs, newspaper clippings, and what looked like surveillance notes, all connected by red string like something from a detective's war room. Sarah's phone light wavered as she leaned closer. The central photograph showed a man in an expensive suit shaking hands with someone whose face had been circled in red ink. Even in the grainy image, she recognized him immediately. Marcus Henley, her former boss, the man whose false accusations had destroyed her career and sent her family spiraling into ruin. Around his photo, dozens of other pictures formed a web of connections. Financial documents, bank statements, property records, all bearing Marcus's name. Someone had been building a case against him, documenting what appeared to be years of financial crimes. The newspaper clippings detailed missing charity funds, suspicious real estate deals, and a federal investigation that had somehow never materialized. Her hands trembling, Sarah pulled down one of the documents. It was a bank statement showing transfers of hundreds of thousands of dollars to offshore accounts. The dates matched her final months at Henley Financial, when she'd tried to report irregularities in the books. When Marcus had turned the tables, claiming she was the one embezzling funds. "Oh my God," she whispered. Emma stirred at the sound, making soft noises that would soon become cries if Sarah didn't move, but she couldn't tear herself away from the wall. Someone else had discovered Marcus's crimes. Someone had proof. Another document caught her eye, a legal brief that made her blood run cold. It outlined a pattern of witness intimidation, showing how Marcus systematically destroyed anyone who threatened to expose him. Sarah's own case was there, along with 3 others who'd tried to blow the whistle. All had been discredited, fired, or worse. Lightning illuminated the room through a grimy window, and in that stark moment, Sarah saw her reflection in the glass. Hollow-eyed, desperate, clutching her sick child in a stranger's hideaway. But she also saw something else, possibility. Emma's crying began in earnest now, demanding attention. Sarah carefully folded the bank statement and slipped it into her jacket pocket before returning to her daughter. As she lifted Emma, soothing her with gentle words, her mind raced with the implications of what she'd found and what had happened to make them abandon such crucial evidence in this forgotten place. The rain hammered against the tin roof like bullets, each drop exploding into a symphony of chaos that matched the storm raging inside Elena's chest. She clutched the photograph tighter, her knuckles white against the faded edges of the paper. The faces staring back at her seemed to shift in the flickering candlelight. Her sister Maria's smile frozen in time, but now carrying secrets Elena had never imagined. Lightning illuminated the cramped interior of the hut, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the walls lined with newspaper clippings. Elena forced herself to read the headlines again, each word cutting deeper than the last. Local teacher missing. Search continues for Maria Santos. Family pleads for information. The dates made her stomach lurch. 3 years ago, right around the time Maria had supposedly moved to the city for that teaching position. The same time she'd stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped being the sister who had raised Elena after their parents died. Elena's phone buzzed, startling her. A text from David. Storm getting worse. Had to pull over. "You and Sophie okay?" She stared at the message, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. How could she explain that she was sitting in what appeared to be someone's obsessive shrine to her dead sister, that everything they'd believed about Maria's disappearance might be a lie? "We're fine," she typed back, the words feeling like betrayals. "Stay safe." Sophie stirred in her arms, mumbling something about wanting to go home. Elena smoothed her daughter's damp hair, inhaling the familiar scent of strawberry shampoo that somehow grounded her in this surreal nightmare. She had to think clearly, had to figure out what this meant for them. The wooden box sat open beside her like a mouth, revealing its secrets. Elena reached inside again, her fingers finding a manila envelope she'd missed before. Inside were more photographs, surveillance shots it looked like. Grainy images of Maria walking alone, getting into a car, talking to someone whose face was always just out of frame. But it was the last photograph that made Elena's blood freeze. Maria stood in front of the elementary school where Elena now taught, the same building Elena walked into every morning. But this picture was recent. She could tell by Maria's haircut, shorter than she'd worn it 3 years ago. The timestamp in the corner read 6 months ago. Elena's mind reeled. Maria was alive, had been alive 6 months ago. But why the newspaper articles about her being missing? Why had she let their family believe she was gone? A new sound cut through the storm, the distant rumble of an engine. Elena's heart hammered as headlights swept across the grimy windows of the hut. Someone was coming. She stuffed the photographs back into the box, her hands shaking as she tried to arrange everything exactly as she'd found it. The engine's sound grew louder, closer. Elena blew out the candle, plunging them into darkness just as the headlights passed by the window. Sophie whimpered at the sudden darkness. "Mama?" "Shh, baby. We're playing a game. We have to be very quiet." Through the window, Elena watched a pickup truck pull up to the hut. Her throat constricted as a figure emerged, tall, wearing a rain slicker, moving with purpose toward the door. The beam of a flashlight swept across the ground. Elena pressed herself against the wall beside the door. Sophie clutched against her chest. Her daughter's breathing seemed impossibly loud in the suffocating silence. The footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. The door handle rattled. The person outside tried the handle again, then knocked. 3 sharp raps that seemed to echo through Elena's bones. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself and Sophie to become invisible. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated. Elena heard the truck door slam, the engine start up again, but instead of leaving, the headlights remained stationary. Whoever it was wasn't going anywhere. Elena's phone buzzed again. Another text from David. "Roads are washing out. Might not make it home tonight. Love you both." The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd sought shelter from the storm, only to find herself trapped in something far more dangerous. The person in the truck was waiting, watching. Did they know someone was inside? Were they the same person who had collected all this evidence about Maria? As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, Elena noticed something she'd missed before. A back window, partially concealed by stacked newspapers. It was small, but she might be able to squeeze through with Sophie. But leaving meant abandoning the evidence. And this box might be the only thing that could lead her to the truth about what happened to Maria, the sister who might still be alive, the sister whose disappearance was clearly more complicated than anyone had imagined. Elena made her decision. She tucked one photograph into her jacket pocket, the recent one of Maria at the school. Whatever happened next, she needed proof of what she'd discovered. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and neither did the truck outside. The photograph slipped from Sarah's trembling fingers, fluttering to the floor like a dying leaf. Her knees buckled, and she gripped the edge of the dusty table to steady herself. The face staring back at her from the scattered images was unmistakably her own, but younger, different somehow. Her hair was shorter, darker, and there was something in her eyes she didn't recognize, a hardness that seemed foreign to everything she knew about herself. Emma stirred in her arms, letting out a small whimper that snapped Sarah back to the present. She sank into the rickety chair, her mind reeling as she tried to process what she was seeing. In one photograph, she stood next to a man she'd never seen before, both of them wearing what looked like police uniforms. In another, she was inside what appeared to be an evidence room, handling items she couldn't quite make out in the dim light. But it was the third photograph that made her blood run cold. She was standing over a body, a woman with auburn hair spread across what looked like a warehouse floor. Sarah was holding something in her hand, something metallic that caught the camera's flash. "This isn't possible," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm still raging outside. She had no memory of any of this, no recollection of being a police officer, of standing in that room, of that woman lying motionless at her feet. With shaking hands, she reached for the manila folder beneath the photographs. Inside were documents that made even less sense than the pictures. A police report dated 3 years ago, signed by Detective Sarah Chen. The name was wrong. Her name was Sarah Matthews, had always been Sarah Matthews. But the signature at the bottom of the report was undeniably hers. The report detailed the death of one Rebecca Thornton, found in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of a city Sarah had never heard of. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head. The investigating officer noted signs of a struggle, but the case was marked as closed, ruled a robbery gone wrong. The final line of the report chilled her to the bone. No further investigation warranted. Case terminated by order of Chief Morrison. Sarah's hands moved of their own accord, flipping through more documents. Bank statements showing deposits into an account she'd never opened, hotel receipts from places she'd never been. And then, at the bottom of the pile, a birth certificate for Emma, but with a different father listed. Not David, her husband of 6 years, but someone named Marcus Chen. The pieces began forming a picture she couldn't accept. According to these documents, She had lived an entire life she couldn't remember. She had been married to this Marcus Chen, had worked as a detective, had been involved in something that ended with a woman's death. Emma began to cry, her small fists batting at Sarah's chest. The familiar weight of her daughter grounded her, reminding her of what was real. She was Sarah Matthews. She lived in Portland. She worked as a graphic designer. She had met David at a coffee shop 4 years ago, and they'd married after a whirlwind romance. Emma was their miracle baby, born just 18 months ago after they'd nearly given up hope. But the evidence in front of her told a different story entirely. She stood abruptly, pacing the small confines of the hut while bouncing Emma gently in her arms. Could she have amnesia? Some kind of dissociative disorder? But that would mean David knew, wouldn't it? You couldn't fake an entire identity without help, unless David wasn't who he claimed to be either. The thought hit her like a physical blow. She remembered their meeting now with crystal clarity, how he'd seemed to know exactly what to say, how he'd appeared at just the right moment when she'd been feeling lost and directionless. She'd always attributed it to fate, to serendipity. But what if it had been something else entirely? She moved back to the table, studying the photographs again. In the background of one image, she could make out a calendar on the wall. The month and year were clearly visible. March, 3 years ago. She tried to remember what she'd been doing then, but her memories from that time were strangely hazy. David had told her she'd been recovering from a car accident, that she'd had some memory issues but nothing serious, just stress and trauma, he'd said. Time would heal everything. But what if time had been meant to bury everything instead? Emma's cries grew more insistent, and Sarah realized she'd been holding her daughter too tightly. She loosened her grip, pressing a kiss to the baby's forehead. Whatever was in this box, whoever she might have been, Emma was real. Her love for her daughter was real. The question was, what else in her life was a lie? Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, but Sarah barely noticed any more. She was trapped in this hut with evidence of a life she couldn't remember and a crime she might have committed. And, somewhere out there, David was looking for them both. The photograph trembled in Sarah's grip as lightning illuminated the hut's interior once more. The face staring back at her was unmistakably her own, but younger, maybe 22 or 23. She wore a red dress she'd never owned, standing beside a man she didn't recognize in what appeared to be some kind of ceremony. Behind them, other figures stood in a semicircle, their faces partially obscured by shadows and time. Her breath came in short gasps. The image was impossible, yet undeniably real. The paper felt aged between her fingers, the edges yellowed and slightly torn. She flipped it over, finding a date scrawled in fading ink, June 15th, 2018. The binding. 2018. The year she'd lost 3 months of her life to what doctors had called a severe breakdown following her mother's death. The year she'd awakened in a hospital bed with gaps in her memory that therapy had never quite filled. Sarah's hands shook as she rifled through more papers scattered across the makeshift table. There were documents bearing her signature, or what looked remarkably like it, on agreements she'd never seen before. Financial transfers, property deeds, and, most disturbing of all, a birth certificate for Emma that listed a father she'd never met. The storm raged harder outside, but Sarah barely noticed. Her world was collapsing from within. She grabbed her phone, praying for even a single bar of service, but found none. The isolation felt suffocating now, trapping her with these impossible revelations. A loose floorboard creaked behind her. Sarah spun around, clutching the photograph to her chest, but saw only shadows dancing in the candlelight. The wind howled through gaps in the walls, creating an otherworldly symphony that made her skin crawl. She forced herself to continue searching, driven by a desperate need to understand. In a small wooden box, hidden beneath what appeared to be an old sleeping bag, she found a journal. The handwriting on the cover was distinctly feminine, though not her own. Inside the front cover, a name was written in careful script, Rebecca Chen, case notes. Sarah's blood ran cold. Rebecca Chen had been her therapist during those lost months in 2018, the woman who'd helped her piece together fragments of memory, who'd guided her through what she'd believed was recovery from grief-induced amnesia. The journal entries were dated, starting from May 2018 and continuing through August of that year. Sarah flipped to a random page, her eyes scanning the clinical notes with growing horror. Subject continues to respond well to treatment. Memory suppression holding steady. She has no recollection of the ceremony or her agreement to participate. The child appears healthy and shows no signs of distress about her altered parentage records. Sarah's legs gave out, and she sank to the floor. The words swam before her eyes as she struggled to process their meaning. Memory suppression, altered parentage records. What had been done to her? What had she agreed to that required such drastic measures to hide? She flipped through more pages, finding detailed accounts of sessions she remembered differently. According to Rebecca's notes, Sarah hadn't been treated for grief-induced breakdown. She'd volunteered for experimental therapy designed to selectively erase specific memories while leaving others intact. But why? What could have been so terrible that she'd choose to forget it entirely? The answer came on one of the final entries, dated August 30th, 2018. Rebecca's handwriting was less careful here, more hurried, as if written in distress. The organization has decided to terminate the program. Too risky, they say, after what happened to the others. Sarah will be the last subject to receive full memory integration therapy, but they've changed the protocol. Instead of restoration, they want complete burial. She'll never remember what Michael did or why she agreed to testify. They're moving her and the child tonight. New identities, new location. I pray she forgives me someday for what we've stolen from her. Michael. The name struck a chord deep in Sarah's suppressed memory, like an echo from a dream. She closed her eyes, trying to grasp at the fragments that threatened to surface, but they slipped away like smoke. A sudden bang from outside made her jump. Through the grimy window, she could see a dark shape moving near the trees, too large and deliberate to be debris blown by the wind. Someone was out there. She blew out the candle and crept to the window. The figure was closer now, definitely human, moving with purpose despite the storm. In the intermittent lightning, she caught glimpses of a familiar silhouette that made her stomach drop. Dr. Rebecca Chen was still alive, and she'd found them. The photograph trembled in Elena's hands as lightning illuminated the hut's interior once more. The face staring back at her was unmistakably her own, but younger, perhaps 22 or 23. She wore a black cocktail dress she didn't remember owning, standing beside a man whose arm wrapped possessively around her waist. The man's face had been carefully scratched out with what looked like a key or knife, deep gouges that spoke of rage and deliberate destruction. But it wasn't the mutilated photograph that made her stomach lurch. It was the date stamped in the corner, June 15th, 2018, the night before her wedding to David. Elena's mind reeled as she tried to process what she was seeing. She had been home that night, having a quiet dinner with her mother and sister, a simple evening before the biggest day of her life. She remembered it clearly, or thought she did. The vanilla candles on the dining table, her mother's nervous laughter, the early bedtime to ensure she looked radiant for the ceremony. Yet here was proof that she had been somewhere else entirely, with someone whose identity had been violently erased from the image. She flipped the photograph over with shaking fingers. Written in faded blue ink was a single word, remember. The handwriting was her own. Thunder crashed overhead as Elena frantically searched through the remaining contents of the box. More photographs emerged, dozens of them. Each showed her in places she'd never been, with people she didn't recognize. A beach house with white shutters, a city skyline she couldn't identify, a dimly lit restaurant where she sat across from a shadowy figure whose face was always just out of frame or deliberately obscured. In every single photograph, she looked happy, genuinely, radiantly happy, in a way that made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name. Beneath the photographs lay a stack of letters, all addressed to her maiden name at an address she'd never lived at. The return address was smudged beyond recognition, But the postmark spanned 3 years, from 2016 to 2019, continuing well into her marriage to David. Elena's hands shook as she opened the first envelope. The letter was brief, written in masculine handwriting she didn't recognize. "E, you can't keep running from this. What happened that night wasn't your fault, but pretending it never occurred won't make it disappear. The treatment was supposed to help you heal, not erase who you are entirely. I'm still here when you're ready to remember. M." Elena's vision blurred as she reached for another letter, this one dated 6 months after her wedding. "Elena, I saw the announcement in the paper. I hope you found peace, but I can't let this go, not when I know what really happened to Sarah Chen. The police closed the case, but we both know the truth. Check the news archives for July 2018. Look for yourself. M. Sarah Chen." The name hit Elena like a physical blow, though she couldn't place why. It felt important, urgent, like a word on the tip of her tongue that refused to surface. She grabbed another letter. "This one more recent, Elena. This is my last attempt to reach you. I know David monitors your mail now, so I'm hoping this gets through. I've hidden everything we gathered in the old place. You know where. If something happens to me, you need to know the truth about that night, about what David did, about why you really agreed to the treatments. The receipt is in the music box. Find it before he does. Michael." The storm outside seemed to intensify as Elena processed the implications. Treatments, memory treatments, the fragments that had been surfacing, the gaps in her recollection, David's careful management of her medical care. It was all beginning to form a terrifying picture. She dug deeper into the box, her fingers closing around a small metal object, a key, old and tarnished, attached to a heart-shaped keychain with the initial M engraved in flowing script. Beneath it, wrapped in tissue paper, was a cell phone, an older model she'd never seen before. Elena powered it on with trembling fingers. The screen flickered to life, and she gasped. Dozens of missed calls and text messages, all from a contact listed simply as Michael. The most recent message was dated just 3 days ago. "Elena, if you're reading this, you found the box. Don't trust David, don't go home, there's more you need to see. The storage unit key's in the music box, 247th on Riverside Drive. I'm sorry for what they did to your mind, but it's time to remember who you really are." The phone slipped from Elena's numb fingers as the full weight of her situation crashed over her. The man she'd trusted with her life, her memories, her very identity, had been systematically erasing pieces of who she was. And somewhere in the shadows of her stolen past was a truth so dangerous that someone had been willing to destroy her mind to keep it buried. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the hut, Elena felt the first stirrings of something she'd forgotten she possessed: rage. The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as lightning illuminated the hut's interior once more. Her younger self stared back at her from the faded image. 17 years old, standing beside Marcus Chen, outside the old Riverside Mill. But it wasn't just any casual photo. Marcus had his arm around her waist, and she was laughing at something he'd whispered in her ear. The intimacy between them was unmistakable. She had no memory of this moment. Sarah's breath came in short gasps as she examined the other items scattered across the makeshift table. A torn movie ticket stub dated 3 months before Marcus's death, a dried flower, a white rose, pressed between the pages of what appeared to be a journal, and beneath it all, a letter written in her own handwriting. "Marcus, I can't keep pretending this isn't happening between us. Meet me tonight at the mill. We need to talk about everything, especially about what David would do if he found out. S." The pen slipped from her numb fingers. David, her husband. Even then, apparently, she'd been torn between 2 men. But how could she have forgotten an entire relationship? How could she have blocked out what seemed to be a significant part of her past? Outside, the storm continued its assault on the fragile structure. Sarah barely noticed. She was too busy rifling through the box, desperate for more clues to a life she couldn't remember living. There were more photos, dozens of them. Marcus teaching her to skip stones by the river, the 2 of them sharing what looked like a picnic in the woods. One particularly intimate shot showed them kissing beneath the old oak tree that still stood in the town square. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in a plastic bag, she found a cassette tape labeled for Sarah, The Truth. Her hand shook as she held it up to the dim light filtering through the gaps in the walls. There was a small portable cassette player on the shelf nearby, covered in dust but seemingly intact. Sarah hesitated. Whatever was on this tape, it was clearly meant for her. But did she want to know? Her family was already in crisis. David's job loss, Emma's behavioral problems, the mounting debt that had forced them to move back to this God-forsaken town. Could she handle another shock? Thunder rolled overhead, making the decision for her. She was trapped here until the storm passed anyway. With trembling fingers, she inserted the tape and pressed play. Static crackled for a moment, then Marcus's voice filled the small space. Hearing it after all these years sent a chill down her spine. Sarah, if you're listening to this, then something has happened to me, and you've finally found this place. I hope to God you never have to hear these words, but if you do, you need to know the truth about that night, about what really happened at the mill. Sarah sank onto the rough wooden chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. I know you don't remember. The doctor said the trauma might cause memory loss, and he was right. But I remember everything, and I wrote it all down before I knew they were coming for me. The tape continued, Marcus's voice growing more urgent. You were there that night, Sarah. We both were. We saw what happened to Jenny Morrison. We saw who killed her, and we saw them dump her body in the river. You wanted to go to the police immediately, but I convinced you to wait. I thought we needed proof, evidence they couldn't dismiss or cover up. I was so stupid, so naive about how powerful they were. Sarah's heart pounded as fragments of memory began to surface. A girl's scream, the splash of something heavy hitting water, running through the woods, branches tearing at her clothes, and Marcus, always Marcus, holding her as she sobbed with terror. They found out we'd seen them. The recording continued. Someone must have spotted us leaving the area. The next day you were in that car accident, except it wasn't an accident, was it? They tried to kill you, Sarah. They ran you off the road and left you for dead. If that trucker hadn't found you when he did. The memories were flooding back now. 23 years of carefully suppressed trauma breaking through like a dam bursting. The accident, weeks in the hospital. David visiting every day, so concerned, so loving. The gaps in her memory that everyone assured her would return but never did. The move to the city immediately after her recovery, far from Millbrook and all its painful associations. I have proof, Marcus's voice whispered through the static. Evidence that will bring them all down. But if something happens to me, you're the only one who knows where to find it. Remember our special place, Sarah. Remember where we carved our initials. That's where I've hidden everything. The tape ended with a click, leaving Sarah alone with the storm and her resurrected memories, and why they might want her dead too. The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as lightning illuminated the hut's interior once more. Her younger self stared back at her, pigtails, gap-toothed smile, clutching a stuffed rabbit she'd forgotten she ever owned. But it wasn't her childhood innocence that made her blood run cold. It was the man standing behind her in the photo, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. The same man whose driver's license lay scattered among the other documents. Marcus Whitfield, the name that had haunted the news broadcasts, the missing person reports, the whispered conversations between her adoptive parents when they thought she wasn't listening. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the dirt floor, fragments of memory rushing back like water through a broken dam. A different house, different voices calling her name. Not Sarah, but something else. The smell of pancakes on Sunday mornings, strong arms lifting her high into the air while she squealed with delight, and then nothing. A void where her life before the age of 7 should have been. The storm's fury seemed to mirror the chaos in her mind. She pressed her palms against her temples, trying to make sense of the impossible. Marcus Whitfield was her father, not her adoptive father who had raised her with gentle patience, but her biological father who had simply vanished from her life. But if he was her father, why was he here? Why were his belongings hidden in this desolate place, like evidence at a crime scene? With shaking hands, she reached for the manila envelope and pulled out its remaining contents. Bank statements showing large cash withdrawals in the weeks before his disappearance. A letter of resignation from his job at the pharmaceutical company, dated but never submitted. And at the bottom, a small notebook filled with his careful handwriting. Sarah angled the notebook toward the weak light filtering through the hut's cracks and began to read. The entries were dated, starting 3 months before Marcus Whitfield's disappearance. The early pages documented his growing concerns about irregularities at work, missing inventory, falsified safety reports, pressure from supervisors to overlook quality control violations. As she read deeper, his paranoia became evident. He wrote about being followed, his phone calls being monitored, veiled threats from colleagues who had once been friends. But it was the final entry that made Sarah's hands go numb. They know I have the evidence. The contaminated batches that were shipped anyway, the children who got sick, the cover-up that goes all the way to the top. I've tried to do this the right way, but they'll never let me testify. I have to disappear before they make me disappear permanently. Sarah will be safer if she never knows the truth about what I discovered, about why I had to leave. Maybe someday she'll understand that everything I did was to protect her. The notebook slipped from her fingers as the full weight of revelation crashed over her. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He had sacrificed everything, including his relationship with her, to expose corporate corruption that had endangered children's lives. The pharmaceutical company he had worked for was Meridian Industries, the same company whose contaminated products had caused a scandal 15 years ago. The same scandal that had resulted in hundreds of lawsuits and eventually led to the company's bankruptcy. But the timeline troubled her. Marcus had disappeared before the scandal became public, before the lawsuits, before any official investigation. His evidence might have been the catalyst that brought down Meridian Industries, but he had never lived to see justice served, unless he was still alive. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she considered the possibility. What if his disappearance had been staged? What if he had been living in hiding all these years, waiting for the danger to pass? She gathered the photographs and documents, studying them with new eyes. The driver's license had expired only 2 years ago, meaning someone had renewed it long after Marcus was supposed to be dead. The bank statements were recent too, showing activity that continued well beyond his disappearance date. Outside, the storm showed signs of weakening, but Sarah barely noticed. She was too busy processing the implications of what she had found. If her father was alive, if he had been in hiding, then this hut might be more than just a storage place for old evidence. It might be a safe house, a refuge he returned to periodically. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. After 20 years of believing herself an orphan, she might have a father who was not only alive but had been protecting her from a distance all this time. But it also meant that whatever danger had forced him into hiding might still exist. And by finding this place, by uncovering his secrets, she might have put both herself and Emma in jeopardy. As if summoned by her fears, she heard something that made her blood freeze. Through the diminishing rain and thunder, the unmistakable sound of a car engine approaching along the muddy road. The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as she stared at the face that had haunted her dreams for 15 years. Marcus Henley, her biological father, stood beside a younger version of Detective Morrison in what appeared to be a police station. Both men were smiling, arms draped over each other's shoulders like old friends. The storm outside seemed to echo the chaos in her mind. Everything she thought she knew about her father's death was crumbling. The official story had always been that Marcus died in a car accident when she was 12, but the documents scattered across the hut's floor told a different tale entirely. She picked up another paper, her heart racing as she recognized Detective Morrison's handwriting. The report was dated 3 months after her father's supposed death, detailing payments made to an offshore account. Her father's account. He didn't die, she whispered to the empty room. Morrison helped him disappear. The implications hit her like a physical blow. If her father had faked his death, if Morrison had been involved from the beginning, then everything about this current investigation was a lie. The detective wasn't trying to solve the Hayes murder. He was trying to cover something up. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from David. Police came by the house. Morrison was asking about you. Where are you? Her fingers flew across the screen. Don't tell him anything. I'll explain later. She needed to think. The evidence in this hut wasn't just about some random crime. It was connected to her family's past in ways she was only beginning to understand. But why would her father fake his death? And what did any of this have to do with Victoria Hayes? Another document caught her attention. It was a property deed dated 18 months ago, transferring ownership of the Hayes estate to a shell company. The witness signature at the bottom made her blood run cold. Marcus Henley. Her father was alive, and he'd been involved with Victoria Hayes shortly before her death. Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. Had Victoria discovered something about her father's fake death? Was she blackmailing him, or had they been working together on something that went wrong? She photographed every document with her phone, her hands shaking as the pieces of a massive conspiracy began to form a picture. The folder labeled insurance claims contained policies worth millions, all processed shortly after deaths that now seemed suspicious. Her father hadn't just faked his own death, he'd been running an elaborate insurance fraud scheme for years. The wind howled through the gaps in the hut's walls, reminding her that time was running out. Morrison would eventually figure out where she'd gone, and when he did, she needed to be ready. But ready for what? Confronting a corrupt detective who'd helped her father disappear? Finding a man who'd let his own daughter grieve for him for 15 years? Her phone rang, David's name flashing on the screen. Sarah, thank God. Where are you? Morrison left, but he seemed agitated. He was asking about your father. David, I need you to listen carefully. Take Emma and go to your sister's house. Don't tell anyone where you're going. What? Sarah, you're scaring me. What's going on? She closed her eyes, trying to find words that wouldn't sound insane. I found something. About my father, about the detective investigating Victoria's murder. I think we're all in danger. What kind of danger? Sarah, just come home and we'll figure this out together. A sound outside made her freeze. Through the rain and wind, she could hear the distant rumble of a car engine. Headlight beams swept across the hut's broken windows as a vehicle approached down the muddy access road. I have to go, she whispered into the phone. Sarah, wait. She ended the call and switched the phone to silent. The car doors slammed outside, and she heard voices, two men, one of which sounded like Morrison. Moving quickly, she gathered the most important documents and stuffed them into her jacket, then crept toward the back of the hut where a window had long since lost its glass. She was definitely here. Morrison's voice carried through the storm. The tire tracks match her car. Are you sure she has it? The second voice was unfamiliar, gravelly and cold. The Hayes woman was thorough. If she hid evidence about the operation, Sarah will find it. Sarah's blood turned to ice. They weren't here to arrest her, they were here to silence her. The front door of the hut creaked open as she slipped through the rear window. The rain immediately soaked through her clothes, but she barely noticed. 20 yards ahead stood the dark outline of the woods where she'd left her car hidden. Behind her, flashlight beams danced through the hut's interior. In moments, they would discover she was gone. She had maybe 30 seconds before they realized she'd escaped through the window. Sarah ran into the darkness, clutching the evidence that could either expose the truth or get her family killed. The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as the full weight of recognition crashed over her. The woman in the image wasn't just familiar, she was identical. The same angular cheekbones, the same deep-set eyes, even the same small scar above the left eyebrow that Sarah had carried since childhood. But this woman wore clothes from another era, her hair styled in victory rolls that belonged to the 1940s. Rain continued to hammer against the hut's walls as Sarah sank onto the dusty floor, her mind reeling. The date on the back of the photograph read October 1943. Impossible. Yet there she was, or someone who could have been her twin, standing beside a man in military uniform outside this very hut. Her fingers moved instinctively to the locket at her throat, the one her adoptive mother had said belonged to her birth family. With shaking hands, she opened it and held it next to the photograph. The woman in the picture wore an identical piece of jewelry. "This can't be real," she whispered, but even as she spoke, fragments of half-remembered conversations began to surface. Her adoptive mother's evasive answers about her origins, the way elderly neighbors sometimes looked at her with startled recognition before quickly glancing away, the recurring dreams of this very landscape that had drawn her here, to this remote corner of Wales. Thunder cracked overhead, but Sarah barely noticed. She was already reaching for the next item in the box, a leather journal bound with a fading ribbon. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with elegant handwriting that made her heart skip. She knew that penmanship. It matched her own perfectly, down to the distinctive way the letters curved and slanted. The first entry was dated September 15th, 1943. "They say the experiments are for the greater good, but I've seen what they do to the others, who come back changed, or don't come back at all. Thomas thinks I'm being paranoid, but I know what I witnessed in the laboratory beneath the manor. The children they bring in aren't the same when they leave, if they leave." Sarah's blood ran cold. Children, experiments. She flipped through more pages, her horror mounting with each entry. "Dr. Meridian injected me again today. The serum burns like liquid fire through my veins, and afterward the world looks different somehow. Sharper. I can hear conversations from rooms away, sense things before they happen. But the cost, God, the cost." Mary aged 20 years in a single night. Little James simply disappeared, as if he'd never existed at all. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely turn the pages. The entries continued, describing a secret facility hidden beneath Blackwood Manor, just 3 miles from where she now sat. Government scientists conducting illegal experiments during wartime, using desperate families and orphaned children as test subjects. The final entry was dated October 30th, 1943. "The serum has done something permanent to me, to us. Thomas says we're no longer bound by normal rules of time or aging, but I feel the pull of decades stretching ahead like a curse. We've decided to hide the evidence of what they've done here and flee. If anyone finds this journal, know that what happened at Blackwood Manor was an abomination. The children they destroyed deserve justice. I pray that someday someone will have the courage to expose the truth." Sarah's mind struggled to process what she was reading. Time manipulation, genetic experiments. But it was the signature at the bottom of the last entry that made her world tilt completely off its axis. Sarah Mitchell, her own name, written in her own handwriting in a journal from 75 years ago. She scrambled through the remaining items in the box with desperate urgency. Birth certificates with impossible dates, medical files documenting cellular regeneration, and finally, at the very bottom, a manila envelope marked Classified, Project Kronos. Inside were scientific reports that read like science fiction, detailed studies of temporal displacement, age regression, and what the documents clinically termed genetic recycling. The test subjects, it appeared, didn't simply age slowly or live extended lives. Their DNA was somehow reset in cycles, allowing them to be reborn with intact memories, but in new timelines. The storm outside seemed to be weakening, but Sarah felt as if a different kind of tempest was tearing through her consciousness. If these documents were real, and the mounting evidence suggested they were, then she wasn't simply Sarah Mitchell, desperate mother hiding from loan sharks. She was the continuation of something that had started decades ago, a living remnant of wartime atrocities that someone had tried very hard to bury. But why was the evidence here, waiting for her to find? And why now, when her own daughter was in danger? As if summoned by her thoughts, her phone buzzed with a new message. The number was unknown, but the words made her blood freeze. Some experiments never truly end. Blackwood Manor. Midnight. Come alone, or Emma pays the price for her mother's past. The old photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as the storm continued to rage outside. Her daughter Emma slept fitfully in the corner, wrapped in the moth-eaten blanket they'd found, while Sarah stared at the impossible image before her. The woman in the wedding dress looked exactly like her, but the date scrawled on the back read 1987, 3 years before Sarah was even born. Lightning illuminated the hut's interior, casting eerie shadows across the walls lined with newspaper clippings. Sarah had been so focused on the photograph that she'd barely noticed them before, but now she could see they formed a timeline of sorts. Missing persons reports, obituaries, police statements, all connected by red string that crisscrossed the space like a spider's web. Her breath caught as she recognized names from her childhood. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly neighbor who had supposedly moved to Florida when Sarah was 12. David Markham, her high school guidance counselor, who had allegedly taken a job in another state. People who had simply vanished from their small town, leaving behind nothing but hastily constructed explanations that no one had questioned too closely. Sarah's fingers traced the red string connecting their photos, following it to a central point where a larger photograph was pinned. It showed a family of 4 standing in front of the very house where Sarah had grown up. But in this picture, it wasn't her parents in the frame. It was the couple from the wedding photo, along with 2 young children she didn't recognize. The sound of Emma stirring made Sarah quickly fold the photograph and stuff it into her jacket pocket. She couldn't let her daughter see this madness, not when she barely understood it herself. Emma was already traumatized enough from their frantic escape from David's increasingly violent behavior. The last thing she needed was to see her mother unraveling over mysterious photographs and conspiracy theories pinned to the walls of an abandoned shack. But as Emma's breathing settled back into the rhythm of sleep, Sarah found herself drawn deeper into the web of evidence. A manila folder tucked behind one of the support beams contained documents that made her stomach lurch. Property deeds showing the transfer of her childhood home from the family in the photograph to her parents. Medical records for someone named Elena Vasquez, someone who shared Sarah's exact birth date and blood type. Most disturbing of all, a death certificate for Elena Vasquez dated just 3 days after Sarah's official adoption papers were filed. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Sarah wasn't who she thought she was. The woman in the wedding dress wasn't just someone who looked like her. She was her mother, her real mother. And the children in the family photograph weren't strangers. One of them had her eyes, her stubborn chin, the same small scar above the left eyebrow that Sarah had always been told came from falling off her tricycle. Thunder crashed overhead, and Sarah realized she was crying. Everything she'd built her identity around was a lie. Her parents, the people who had raised her, loved her, given her the foundation she'd used to build her own life, were part of something darker than she could have imagined. The gentle father who had taught her to ride a bike, the nurturing mother who had bandaged her scraped knees and celebrated her achievements. What role had they played in the disappearance of her real family? A new sound cut through the storm's fury, the distant rumble of an engine. Sarah's blood ran cold as headlights swept across the hut's single window. She quickly began gathering the most crucial pieces of evidence, her hands shaking as she stuffed photographs and documents into her jacket. Someone was coming, and instinct told her it wasn't help. The engine shut off, and Sarah heard car doors slamming. Multiple voices carried on the wind, though she couldn't make out words over the rain. Emma stirred again, and Sarah gently placed a hand over her daughter's mouth, whispering urgently for her to stay quiet and still. Through a crack in the wooden wall, Sarah could see 2 figures approaching the hut with flashlights. One walked with a familiar limp, her adoptive father, Robert, the man who had supposedly been frantically searching for them after they'd fled David's abuse. But there was nothing frantic about his methodical approach now. This was the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly where to find what he was looking for. Sarah's mind raced through their options. The back of the hut had partially collapsed, but the opening might be large enough for them to squeeze through. If they could make it to the woods beyond, they might be able to lose their pursuers in the darkness. But Emma was exhausted, and the storm would make navigation nearly impossible. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Sarah held her breath, pressing Emma closer to her chest. After 34 years of lies, she was about to learn the truth about her past. The question was whether she and Emma would survive long enough to do anything about it. The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as Marcus stepped closer, his shadow falling across the faded image. 23 years had passed since it was taken, but she could still smell the cheap perfume her mother wore that day, still feel the scratchy fabric of her Sunday dress against her 7-year-old skin. "Where did you get this?" Marcus's voice was barely above a whisper, but the menace in it made her blood freeze. "I found it here," she managed, backing toward the far wall. In the floor, his laugh was hollow, devoid of any warmth. "Of course you did. Do you know what this means, Sarah? What you've stumbled into?" She clutched Emma tighter, feeling her daughter's small body shivering against her chest. The storm outside seemed to echo the chaos in her mind as fragments of memory began assembling themselves into a horrifying picture. "My mother worked for the Hendersons," she said slowly, testing each word. "She cleaned their house." "Your mother did more than clean." Marcus moved to the window, peering through the gaps in the boarded wood. She saw things, heard things, things that could have destroyed very important people. The air in the hut felt thick, suffocating. Sarah's mind raced back to those final weeks before her mother's accident, remembering the hushed phone calls, the way she would jump at every sound. The envelope of cash she'd hidden in the coffee tin, telling Sarah it was for emergencies. "The car accident," Sarah whispered, pieces clicking into place. It wasn't an accident. Marcus turned back to her, and for the first time since he'd arrived, she saw something almost resembling sympathy in his eyes. "Your mother was a good woman, Sarah, but she was naive. She thought she could take what she knew and disappear with you, start over somewhere new. She was trying to protect me. She was trying to blackmail Senator Henderson." His voice hardened again. She had evidence of his involvement with the Riverside development scandal. Photos, recordings, documents, proof that he'd taken bribes, manipulated zoning laws, destroyed wetlands, millions of dollars in illegal deals. Sarah's legs felt weak. She slumped against the wall, still holding Emma, as the weight of understanding crashed over her. "The Henderson family that sponsored my education, that helped me get into college. Guilt money. The senator's way of keeping tabs on you, making sure you never asked the wrong questions." Marcus began pacing the small space, his footsteps creaking on the old floorboards. "For 23 years they've watched you, waiting to see if your mother told you anything, if she left anything behind. But she didn't," Sarah said desperately. "I don't know anything. I was just a child." "I know that. You know that. But they don't." He stopped pacing, fixing her with a stare that chilled her to the bone. "And now you've found this." The photograph felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in her hands. She looked down at her younger self, standing next to her mother in the Hendersons' elaborate foyer, both of them smiling at the camera. But it wasn't the image itself that mattered. It was what was visible in the background. The partially open door of Senator Henderson's office, revealing him hunched over a desk with 2 other men, stacks of cash visible between them. She hid the evidence here, Sarah realized, in this hut. Smart woman, too smart for her own good. Marcus pulled out his phone, checking something on the screen. "They're coming, Sarah. Senator Henderson died 5 years ago, but his son David is running for governor now. He can't afford for this to surface." Emma stirred in her arms, whimpering softly. Sarah kissed her daughter's forehead, tasting salt from her own tears. "What do they want?" "The same thing they've always wanted, for this to disappear, for you to disappear." The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Outside, the storm was beginning to subside, but Sarah knew the real tempest was just beginning. She thought of Jake, probably frantic with worry, searching for them in the storm. She thought of the life she'd built, the safety she'd believed in, all of it crumbling around her like the rotting walls of this forgotten place. "There's another way," Marcus said quietly, and something in his tone made her look up sharply. "What do you mean?" He was staring at the photograph with an expression she couldn't read. "I've been doing their dirty work for 15 years, Sarah, following orders, cleaning up messes, keeping secrets. But I have a daughter too. She's about Emma's age." Hope flickered in Sarah's chest, fragile as candlelight. "You'll help us?" Before he could answer, the distant sound of car engines cut through the diminishing rain. Marcus's face went grim as he moved back to the window. "They're here," he said, "and we're out of time." The silence in Marcus's study felt different now, charged with the weight of revelations that hung between them like a live wire. Sarah clutched the yellowed photograph in her trembling hands, studying the faces of 3 young men who looked like they owned the world. One of them was unmistakably her husband, though decades younger, his arms slung around the shoulders of 2 companions she'd never seen before. "You said there were 3 of you that night," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain still pattering against the windows. "David, you, and—" "Thomas Chen," Marcus finished, the name falling from his lips like a confession. "Your brother-in-law knew him as Tommy back then. We all did." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Sarah's mind raced back to every conversation she'd had with David about his past, every carefully constructed story about his college years, his early career, the friends he'd left behind. None of it had included Marcus. None of it had included anyone named Thomas Chen. "The man in the hut," she said slowly, pieces of a horrific puzzle clicking into place. "The body I found, that was Thomas." Marcus nodded, his weathered face etched with 25 years of guilt. "We were young, stupid, full of ourselves. David had this idea, said he knew about some money, a lot of money, sitting in an old safe at a construction site his father's company was working on. Petty cash for the crew, but thousands of dollars to us back then." Sarah felt sick. The David she knew, the man who coached their daughter's soccer team and volunteered at the food bank, had once been a thief. But that wasn't the worst of it. She could see in Marcus's eyes that the story was far from over. "We broke in on a Friday night, figured we'd have the whole weekend before anyone noticed." David cracked the safe. His old man had taught him about locks and security systems. "We thought we were so clever." Marcus's laugh was bitter, hollow, but Thomas got greedy, started talking about coming back, hitting other sites. David and I wanted out, said it was a one-time thing. Thomas wouldn't let it go. The photograph crumpled slightly in Sarah's grip. "So you killed him?" "No." Marcus's denial was sharp, desperate. "It wasn't like that. We arranged to meet at the old hut to split the money and go our separate ways. But Thomas showed up with a gun, said if we weren't going to help him continue, then he'd make sure we couldn't rat him out either. There was a struggle and—" Sarah closed her eyes, seeing again the skeleton in the corner of the hut, the scattered bones that had once been a young man with plans and dreams, and a family somewhere who probably never learned what happened to him. "The gun went off," Marcus continued. "David was holding it when Thomas lunged at him. We panicked. We were 22 years old, and suddenly there was a body and blood, and we knew our lives were over. So we buried him under the floorboards and swore never to speak of it again." 25 years, Sarah said, opening her eyes to meet his tortured gaze. "You've both been living with this for 25 years. David put himself through law school with his share of that money, built his practice, married you, had Emma. He became a good man, Sarah. Whatever he was that night, he's spent every day since trying to make up for it." The irony wasn't lost on her. David had become a criminal defense attorney, dedicating his life to helping people who found themselves on the wrong side of the law. How many sleepless nights had he spent wondering if he deserved the redemption he sought for his clients? "The development project," Sarah said suddenly. "Morrison Group wants to build luxury homes right where the hut stands. That's why you're selling, isn't it? You need the body gone before they start digging." Marcus flinched. "When I heard about Morrison's plans, I knew we had to do something. I thought maybe I could handle it myself, but that storm, when you found him first, You've been moving the remains. It wasn't a question. Sarah remembered the disturbed earth, the scattered bones in different positions than when she'd first discovered them. You went back. I had to. For David's sake, for Emma's. Your family doesn't deserve to pay for our sins. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes pleading. I can finish this, Sarah. I can make Thomas disappear forever, and no one else has to get hurt. David never has to know you found out. But even as he spoke the words, they both heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway, its headlights sweeping across the rain-soaked windows. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the familiar rumble of David's engine. Her husband was home. The safe house felt more like a prison with each passing hour. Elena paced the small living room while Marcus worked frantically at his laptop, cross-referencing the evidence they'd gathered with his contacts in law enforcement. The storm had finally passed, but darker clouds seemed to gather around their situation with each revelation. I've got something, Marcus said, his voice tight with concern. The bank records you found in that hut, they're connected to a money laundering operation that goes back 15 years. But Elena, there's more. She stopped pacing, her heart hammering. What kind of more? Your father wasn't just a witness to the Ravencroft murder. According to these financial records, he was laundering money for the same network that killed Judge Ravencroft. Marcus turned the laptop screen toward her. Look at these deposit patterns from 2008 to 2010. Regular transfers always just under the federal reporting threshold. Elena stared at the screen, watching her world crumble further. That's impossible. My father was honest. He worked construction, paid his taxes. Elena, Marcus's voice was gentle but firm. Construction was the perfect cover. Look at these invoices, phantom contracts for projects that never existed, billing for materials that were never delivered. It's textbook laundering. The room spun slightly. Elena gripped the back of a chair, forcing herself to stay upright. So Detective Morrison was right. My father was dirty. It's more complicated than that. Marcus pulled up another file. From what I can piece together, your father got in over his head. Started small. Maybe he needed money for your mother's medical bills. Maybe they pressured him. But by 2009, he was trying to get out. How do you know that? Marcus pointed to a series of emails he'd recovered from a backup server. He was communicating with someone using coded language, but the intent is clear. He wanted protection, wanted to testify. And look at the dates. This correspondence starts just 2 weeks before Judge Ravencroft was murdered. Elena's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, your daughter is safe. For now. Come to the old pier at Millfield Harbour. Midnight. Come alone, or she disappears forever. Her blood turned to ice. They have Sophia. Marcus was beside her instantly, reading the message. We call the police, now. No, Elena's voice was steel. You saw what happened when we trusted Morrison. How do we know who else is compromised? How do we know this whole safe house isn't being watched? As if summoned by her paranoia, Marcus's laptop chimed with an incoming message. The screen flickered, then displayed a live video feed that made Elena's knees buckle. Sophia sat in what looked like an abandoned warehouse, her hands bound but her eyes defiant. She was pale but alert, and Elena could see she was trying to stay strong. A figure in shadow moved behind her, just out of the camera's range. A distorted voice came through the laptop speakers. You have something that belongs to us, Elena. Your father's insurance policy. We know he hid evidence before he died, evidence that could destroy everything we've built. I don't know what you're talking about, Elena said to the screen, though her mind raced back to the hut, to the documents they'd found. The offshore account numbers, the client list, the real records of who was being protected and who was being eliminated. Your father was clever. He kept copies of everything. We found most of his hiding places, but not all. You're going to tell us where the rest is hidden. Marcus stepped into the camera's view. Let the girl go. This is between you and us. The figure laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Detective Chen. Yes, We know exactly who you are. Internal Affairs, recently reassigned, currently investigating corruption in your own department. How's that working out for you? Elena felt the walls closing in. What do you want? Simple trade. The location of your father's remaining evidence cache for your daughter's life. You have until midnight to decide. And Detective Chen, if we see any police activity, any attempt at a rescue, the girl dies. We have people everywhere. Police, federal agents, prosecutors. There's nowhere you can run that we won't find you. The video feed cut out, leaving them in suffocating silence. Marcus was already moving. They're bluffing about having people everywhere. They can't possibly... Can't they? Elena rounded on him. Look how easily they found us. Look how they knew exactly who you are, what you're investigating. My father thought he could outsmart them, and they killed him. Judge Ravencroft was supposed to be protected, and they got to him too. She walked to the window, staring out at the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, her daughter was trapped, scared, depending on Elena to save her, and the only bargaining chip she had was evidence that could destroy the very people who might be her only chance of survival. There's something else, she said quietly. Something I didn't tell you about what we found in that hut. The police station's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Sarah sat across from Detective Morrison, her hands trembling around a lukewarm cup of coffee. The evidence from the hut spread across the metal table between them like pieces of a puzzle that kept reshaping itself with each new revelation. Your husband never mentioned knowing Vincent Carrera? Morrison asked again, his pen hovering over his notepad. The repetition of the question felt like a weight pressing down on Sarah's chest. Never. The word came out as barely a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. David never talked about his work friends, said he wanted to keep home and office separate. Morrison's partner, Detective Hayes, leaned against the wall behind him. She'd been quiet for most of the interview, but Sarah could feel her watching, analyzing every gesture and inflection. The silence stretched until Hayes finally spoke. Mrs. Chen, we've been investigating Carrera's disappearance for 8 months. The evidence you found suggests he discovered something about the Meridian Industries embezzlement scheme. Something worth killing for. Sarah's mind raced back to David's late nights, his nervous energy in recent months, the way he'd started checking his phone obsessively. Signs she'd attributed to work stress now took on sinister new meanings. The photographs you found, Morrison continued, sliding one across the table, show Carrera meeting with someone in the Meridian parking garage. The timestamp is 2 days before he disappeared. Do you recognize the other person? Sarah stared at the grainy image. The second figure was mostly in shadow, but something about the posture, the way they held their shoulders, seemed familiar. Her stomach clenched as recognition dawned. I think I need to call my lawyer. Hayes pushed off from the wall. Sarah, we're not trying to trap you. We think your family might be in danger. If your husband was involved with Carrera, if he knew what Carrera knew, the implications hung in the air like smoke. Sarah thought about Emma, probably asleep by now at her sister's house, unaware that her world was crumbling. She thought about David, still missing, still just beyond reach of her frantic calls and texts. There's something else, Morrison said quietly. He pulled out another photograph, this one taken from a different angle. The second figure's face was clearer now, caught in the brief illumination of a security light. Sarah's coffee cup slipped from her nerveless fingers, hitting the floor with a sharp crack. The familiar features staring back at her from the photograph belonged to Marcus Webb, David's business partner and one of their closest friends. Marcus, who'd been at Emma's last birthday party. Marcus, who'd helped them move into their current house. Marcus, who'd called her just yesterday asking if she'd heard from David. You know him, Hayes observed. Sarah nodded slowly. Marcus Webb. He and David started Meridian together 5 years ago. Her voice sounded distant, disconnected, as if someone else was speaking. But this doesn't make sense. Why would Marcus meet with Vincent in secret? Why wouldn't David know about it? Morrison exchanged a look with his partner. Mrs. Chen, what if your husband did know about it? What if that's why he's missing? The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on finding David, so certain he was a victim of circumstances beyond his control, that she hadn't considered the alternative. What if David hadn't been taken? What if he'd run? "We found financial records in that hut," Hayes said gently. Carrera had been tracking money transfers from Meridian accounts to offshore holdings. $3.7 million over 18 months. The transfers were authorized by 2 signatures. Sarah closed her eyes, but the images behind her eyelids were worse than the stark reality of the interrogation room. David's signature, Marcus's signature. 2 friends who'd built a business together, who'd apparently torn it down just as efficiently. "Mrs. Chen?" Morrison's voice seemed to come from very far away. "We need you to think carefully in the weeks before your husband disappeared. Did he seem anxious? Did he mention any problems with the business? Any disagreements with Marcus?" Sarah forced herself to focus, to push through the shock and think. There had been something. A phone call David had taken in their bedroom, his voice rising before he'd caught himself and lowered it to an urgent whisper. She'd asked about it later, but he'd brushed off her concerns. "There was a call," she said finally. "About 3 weeks ago. David seemed upset afterward, distracted. When I asked, he said it was just a client issue, but..." "But," Hayes prompted. "He started working later after that, and he moved his laptop. He used to leave it on the kitchen counter, but suddenly it was always locked in his study." Sarah looked up at the detectives. "You think Marcus killed Vincent Carrera?" "We think it's possible," Morrison admitted. "And if your husband found out, if he threatened to expose what happened..." Sarah's phone buzzed, a text message. With shaking fingers, she looked at the screen and felt her blood turn to ice. The message was from David's phone. "Stop looking for me. It's not safe. Trust no one." The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as Marcus stepped closer, his shadow falling across the faded image. 25 years had weathered his face, but she could still see the young man who had once promised her the world, the same man who had murdered her sister. "You always were too curious for your own good," he said, his voice carrying that familiar warmth that now made her skin crawl. "Even as children, you couldn't leave well enough alone." Sarah's mind raced, piecing together fragments she'd tried so hard to forget. The night Rebecca disappeared, Marcus had been there, offering comfort, helping with the search. He'd held Sarah while she cried, whispering reassurances that they'd find her sister safe. All the while, Rebecca's body had been cooling in the woods behind the old hut. "Why?" The word escaped her lips as barely a whisper. Marcus sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Rebecca was going to ruin everything. She found out about the money I'd taken from my father's business, threatened to tell everyone unless I broke up with you and left town." His eyes hardened. "I couldn't let her destroy my future. Our future." The irony was suffocating. Rebecca had died trying to protect Sarah from a man she thought was wrong for her sister. She'd been right, but her sacrifice had been meaningless. Sarah had married him anyway, built a life with him, raised his children. "Emma," Sarah breathed, suddenly remembering her daughter was still out there in the storm. "Where is she, Marcus?" "Safe," he replied, but something in his tone made her blood freeze. "For now." Thunder crashed overhead, and Sarah realized the storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest brewing in this small, forgotten space. She glanced around desperately, noting the old tools hanging on the walls, the narrow window black with night, the single door that Marcus now blocked. "You can't seriously be thinking of hurting me," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I'm your wife, the mother of your children." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You stopped being my wife the moment you walked into this place, the moment you started digging into things that should stay buried." He pulled something from his jacket pocket, a small, familiar object that made Sarah's heart stop. Rebecca's locket, the one she'd been wearing the night she'd disappeared. "I kept it," Marcus said, turning the tarnished silver over in his palm, "as a reminder of what I was capable of when someone threatened what was mine." He looked up at Sarah. "Just like you're threatening it now." Outside, Sarah could hear Emma calling her name, the sound growing closer. Panic surged through her as she realized her daughter was walking straight into danger. "She doesn't know anything," Sarah said quickly. "Emma has no idea what this place is. We can leave right now. Forget this ever happened. I won't tell anyone." "Like you didn't tell anyone about finding Rebecca's diary in the attic last month?" Marcus's eyes glittered dangerously. "You think I didn't notice you reading it? Researching the case online? You've been building up to this for weeks." Sarah's breath caught. She thought she'd been so careful, so discreet in her investigation. But Marcus had always been observant, calculating. It's what made him successful in business and apparently what had helped him cover up murder for 2.5 decades. The door rattled as wind drove against it, and Emma's voice came again, closer now. "Mom, are you in there?" Marcus moved toward the door, and Sarah saw her chance. She lunged for the hammer hanging on the wall behind her, her fingers closing around the worn wooden handle just as Marcus spun around. "Don't," he warned, his voice deadly calm. "You're not a killer, Sarah. It's what I've always loved about you. Your gentleness, your inability to hurt anyone." "You're right," Sarah said, gripping the hammer tighter. "I'm not a killer, but I am a mother." The door burst open, and Emma stumbled in, soaked and shivering. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene, her mother holding a weapon, her father standing too close, the photographs scattered across the floor. "Dad?" Emma's voice was small, confused. "What's going on?" For a split second, Marcus's attention shifted to their daughter, and Sarah saw vulnerability cross his features. Despite everything, he loved Emma. That love might be the only thing standing between them and disaster, or it might be what finally pushed him over the edge. Sarah kept the hammer raised, her body positioned between Marcus and Emma. 25 years of lies were crumbling around them, and she could feel the weight of truth pressing down like the storm outside. Whatever happened next would determine not just whether they survived the night, but whether Emma would ever be able to trust anyone again. The wind howled through the open door, and Sarah realized there was no going back. The rain hammered against the cabin windows as Sarah stared at the photographs scattered across the wooden table, her hands trembling. David's face stared back at her from dozens of images, some recent, some from years ago. Her husband, the man she'd shared a bed with for 15 years, the father of her children, had been watching the Hendricks family long before they'd ever met. "Mom?" Emma's voice cut through the storm's fury. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah quickly gathered the photos, shoving them back into the metal box. "Nothing, sweetheart, just some old papers." But her mind raced with the implications, the newspaper clipping about the missing Hendricks girl, the detective's badge belonging to Marcus Chen, and now proof that David had been surveilling her family for years. It all pointed to a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Her phone buzzed. A text from David: "Storm's getting worse. Staying at the station tonight. Are you and Emma safe?" The casual concern in his message now felt sinister. How long had he been lying to her? How long had their entire marriage been built on deception? "Mom, someone's coming." Emma pressed her face against the rain-streaked window. Through the darkness, headlights cut through the storm, growing brighter as they approached the cabin. Sarah's heart pounded. She tucked the metal box under her jacket and moved to the window. The vehicle stopped, and a figure emerged, hunched against the driving rain. As the person stepped into the weak glow of the cabin's porch light, Sarah recognized the face that had haunted her dreams for weeks. Marcus Chen. "Stay back from the window," Sarah whispered to Emma, pulling her daughter behind the old couch. The detective's knock came sharp and urgent against the door. "Mrs. Morrison, I know you're in there. We need to talk." Sarah hesitated. Chen was supposed to be dead. David had told her the body was found days ago, yet here he stood very much alive, another lie from her husband. "Please," Chen called out, "your family is in danger. David isn't who you think he is." Against every instinct screaming at her to stay hidden, Sarah approached the door. "How do I know you're really Marcus Chen? How do I know this isn't a trap?" "Because I've been investigating your husband for 3 years. Because I know about the Hendricks case, about what really happened to that missing girl. And because David Morrison isn't even his real name. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She unlocked the door with shaking fingers, and Chen stepped inside, water pooling around his boots. Up close, she could see exhaustion etched in every line of his face, and something else, desperation. 15 years ago, your husband was Thomas Kellner, Chen began without preamble. He was a person of interest in several missing persons cases across 3 states. The Hendricks girl was just one of them. That's impossible. But even as Sarah spoke the words, she felt their hollowness. The photographs, the surveillance, David's strange absences, his intimate knowledge of police procedure, pieces of a puzzle she'd refused to see were falling into place. The real David Morrison died in a car accident in Nevada in 2008. Thomas Kellner assumed his identity, moved here, and began building a new life, a normal life, complete with a wife and children who could provide the perfect cover. Emma whimpered from behind the couch. Sarah's maternal instincts warred with her need to understand the truth. Why should I believe you? David said you were obsessed, that you were making things up. Chen pulled out a waterproof folder from his jacket. Because I've spent 3 years gathering evidence. Because the real reason he married you wasn't love. It was because your father was Sheriff Hendricks, the man who investigated his crimes and got too close to the truth. The folder contained documents, police reports, and more photographs. Sarah saw her father's handwriting on evidence reports, notes about suspicious activities, a growing case file that had apparently been buried after his sudden death. Your father didn't die of a heart attack, Mrs. Morrison. He was getting close to exposing Thomas Kellner. Too close. The room spun around Sarah. Every memory, every tender moment with David, every time he'd comforted her about her father's death, all of it took on a sinister new meaning. She thought of Jake, safe at his friend's house, and felt a crushing relief that he wasn't here. "Where's the real evidence?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Where's the proof that would stand up in court?" Chen's expression darkened. "That's the problem. David Thomas, he's been systematically destroying evidence for years, using his position, his access. The only thing left is hidden somewhere he thinks no one would look, somewhere connected to your family." Thunder crashed overhead, and the cabin's lights flickered. In that moment of darkness, Sarah understood that her old life was over. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back to the illusion of safety she'd built with a man who had never really existed. The silence in the old hut felt different now, charged with the weight of truth finally spoken. Sarah sat across from Detective Morrison, the evidence box between them like a bridge spanning decades of lies. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving only the gentle patter of rain on the roof and the distant sound of sirens growing closer. "They'll be here soon," Morrison said, his weathered face etched with something between relief and regret. "The team I called, good people who'll handle this right." Sarah nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of her father's confession letter. The paper felt fragile, like it might crumble under the weight of its contents. 27 years her father had carried this secret, and now it was hers to bear. "Emma doesn't know," she whispered, "about any of this. About what her grandfather did. About why we really had to leave town so suddenly when she was little." Morrison leaned back in his chair, the old wood creaking. "Maybe that's for the best, for now. Girl's been through enough." Through the cracked window, Sarah could see movement in the distance, headlights cutting through the grey afternoon. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Hospital called. Emma's awake. Asking for you." The words hit her like a physical blow, relief flooding through her so suddenly her hands shook. "She's awake," she breathed, showing Morrison the message. "My daughter's awake." "Go," he said immediately, standing. "I'll handle things here. The evidence isn't going anywhere, and this has waited long enough." But Sarah hesitated, looking around the hut one last time, this place where her father had hidden his darkest moment, where she'd sought shelter and found instead the key to everything that had shaped her life, the murders that had driven them from their home, The guilt that had eaten away at her father until cancer seemed like a mercy. "What happens now?" she asked. "To his memory, to our family's name." Morrison's expression softened. "Truth doesn't make villains of victims, Sarah. Your father made a terrible mistake, but he was a 17-year-old kid who panicked after an accident. He spent his whole life paying for it, protecting you from it. That counts for something." The sound of vehicles was closer now, multiple engines cutting through the quiet. Sarah stood, suddenly desperate to get to Emma, to hold her daughter and feel the warmth of life and breath and beating heart. "The Hendricks family," she said, thinking of the victims whose names she'd learned from the yellowed newspaper clippings. "Do they have anyone left?" "A granddaughter in Portland. I'll make sure she knows what really happened, that it wasn't some random violence. Sometimes knowing matters more than justice." Sarah gathered her things, pausing at the door. Behind her, Morrison was carefully placing items back in the evidence box. Her father's letter, the blood-stained shirt, the photographs that had captured a moment of panic that rippled across decades. "Detective," she called back, "why did you really come here, after all these years?" He looked up, and in his eyes she saw the weight of his own secrets, his own regrets. "Because I knew your father. Before that night. He was a good kid, and what happened after, it broke something in this whole town. I always wondered if there was more to the story." The first police car was pulling up the muddy track toward the hut. Sarah could see the officers inside, their faces serious and focused. Behind them came a van marked with crime scene unit logos, and behind that, another sedan with its emergency lights flashing. "Will you tell them?" she asked. "About who he became? The man who raised me, who donated to charity every year on the anniversary of their deaths, who never touched alcohol again because he couldn't forgive himself for that one night?" Morrison nodded. "I'll tell them everything. The whole truth, not just the pieces that fit in a case file." Sarah stepped out into the cool air, breathing deeply for what felt like the first time in hours. Her car was still there, faithful and waiting, splattered with mud but ready to take her back to her real life, to Emma's bedside and David's worried face and all the challenges that remained. As she drove away, she watched the hut shrink in her rearview mirror until it was just another speck in the landscape. But she carried its secrets with her now, woven into the fabric of who she was and who she would become. The storm had brought her here seeking shelter, and she was leaving with something she'd never expected to find: the truth about her father's past and, perhaps more importantly, the courage to face whatever came next. Her phone rang as she reached the main road. David's voice was thick with emotion. "Sarah, come quickly. Emma's asking about the trip we planned to the coast this summer. She remembers everything."